Today's presentation will be focused on zoonotic and vector-borne diseases, which are really important diseases when we think about environmental health and the role the environment plays. By the end of this chapter in this presentation, you should be able to discuss how human environmental change allows for diseases to emerge between animals and humans, how a disease may be transmitted from an animal to a human, what are the definitions for a vector-borne and a zoonotic disease, and identify different diseases transmitted by these types of vectors, arthropod vectors or zoonoses, and discuss methods used to control these types of diseases. Zoonosis refers to an infection or an infectious disease transmissible under natural conditions from vertebrate animals to humans. The main methods for transmission of zoonoses include contact with skin, a bite or scratch from an animal, inhalation or ingestion, or the bite of an arthropod vector. Recently, there was a very sad case where a woman went to India during a yoga retreat, was bitten by a puppy, came back, and later developed rabies and died. Rabies is an example of a zoonotic disease. A vector is any insect or living carrier that transports an infectious agent from an infected individual to a susceptible individual. Examples of vectors and vector-borne diseases include rodents, like rats, arthropods, that we're all familiar with even in Georgia, mosquitoes, and diseases that can be transmitted this way are, of course, very well-known things like malaria or Lyme disease, but also things like West Nile or Zika virus, etc. Malaria, of course, is a disease that we are all very familiar with. It causes illness and death around the world. 40% of the world's population is at risk from the disease, and it's endemic or present at high levels in Central and South America, Africa, India, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Oceania. The annual death toll for malaria is very high, perhaps as high as 1 million people per year. The agents, there are 4 different parasites that cause malaria. They're all Plasmodium or Plasmodia, but then they have different species: Falciparum, Vivax, Ovale, and Malariae. They are transmitted in different places in the world. Malaria's direct cost is estimated to be $12 billion, and that's treatment and prevention, like medicines or hospitalization, pesticide use, and then it also costs lost productivity, earnings, and negative impacts on travel and tourism. Transmission is a very complex process, and the life cycle of the mosquito and the parasite is also very complex. The main route of transmission is through the bite of an infected Anopheles mosquito. This diagram, which is very complicated, describes the different life cycle stages of both the parasite, Plasmodium, and the roles that the human host or another non-human host and the mosquito have. In the past, we controlled malaria with spraying with pesticides that controlled the mosquito. A main pesticide we used to use was DDT, and we also developed drugs that could stop the implications of the parasite in the body. So people either took the drugs before they traveled to an endemic area, or they took them once they were infected with the parasite. However, we've stopped the use of DDT, or did in the past, because we found it was harmful to wildlife. A very important scientist named Rachel Carson discovered that DDT was destroying bird eggs and wasn't allowing bird eggs to be strong enough for birds to hatch. She produced a book called Silent Spring, which was the focus of the overuse of pesticides. And so the US banned pesticides, and in many other countries they weren't used. So we stopped using DDT, and it became very difficult to control malaria. South Africa, however, has returned to using indoor residual spraying, and we have started to see the good impact that this can have, and so it's being used more, but cautiously. Leishmaniasis is another disease transmitted by the bite of an infected sandfly. This is a picture of cutaneous leishmaniasis, which means it's on the surface of the skin. The reservoir tends to be wild rodents, humans, or dogs. The disease is transmitted from the reservoir, which may not have the illness, to a host, like a human, and it's done that by a sandfly. And it's endemic in a total of 82 countries. Very difficult to control. Things that are associated with leishmaniasis in the environment is when humans move into endemic areas because of things like increasing urbanization, agricultural projects in endemic areas, and then climate change. So the sandflies can only live in certain climates, and their distribution or range can change depending on those climate factors. Another prominent example of a zoonosis is Yersinia pestis. This is the infectious agent for plague. It's a condition that infects both humans and animals, and the disease is transmitted by the bite of a flea harbored by rodents. Historians believe that plague was caused by fleas from infested rats in the Middle Ages. This is worldwide distribution. Approximately 20 years ago, there are cases where plague occurs in animals. It's very rare in humans, and if caught soon, it can be treated. Yersinia pestis is a bacterium, and so you can treat it with antibiotics, but you have to know. And it's never proceeded on, in many cases, for example, in the United States, to human transmission. There are very few cases of human-to-human transmission of this disease. Lyme disease is a condition identified 4 decades ago where a cluster of arthritis cases occurred among children in Lyme, Connecticut. The agent is a bacterium called Borrelia burgdorferi, and the transmission is associated with ticks. The ticks ingest blood by puncturing the skin of the host, and that's when they transmit the bacteria. There are lots of ticks that can carry these type of bacteria, and they're found around the United States. Lyme disease tends to cause chronic illness in people, and it's a very difficult disease to diagnose. Often people won't even know they've been bitten by a tick, although there are some key features that would demonstrate you've been bitten by a tick. Other diseases transmitted by ticks include Rocky Mountain spotted fever. This is transmitted by a rickettsial agent, a different type of organism, like a bacterium, but it has slightly different characteristics. And the case fatality rate is quite high. It's rare, but if you were ill, it would be quite serious. Viral hemorrhagic fevers are viruses that require an animal or insect host as a natural reservoir. Animals can serve as rodents like deer, and the viruses are limited to geographic areas where those rodents or animal reservoirs are. Arthropod-borne viral diseases are a group of diseases that are viral diseases transmitted by blood-feeding arthropod vectors. The most common vectors for these diseases are mosquitoes, but others can, and they transmit a virus. So in the past, we've been talking about Plasmodium, which is a parasite. We've been talking about bacterial diseases like Yersinia pestis or Lyme disease, Borrelia burgdorferi. Now we're talking about viruses. So vectors can transmit all kinds of infectious diseases. Main clinical symptoms for arboviral diseases are central nervous system illness, sometimes self-limited fevers with or without rash, hemorrhagic fevers which cause hemorrhaging, and then sometimes arthritis and rash that could last very long periods of time. Zika virus is another arbovirus disease that's been in the news in the last 5 years. Some arboviruses cause encephalitis, which is a swelling of the brain, and spinal cord. And these diseases prominent in the United States include St. Louis encephalitis and Western equine encephalitis. The Western equine encephalitis principally infects horses, but can be transmitted to humans, although it's rare. First, the virus is transmitted by the bite of a mosquito. The reservoir hosts are often non-human vertebrate hosts, wild birds, small animals, and then they may infect hosts like humans and sometimes, like I mentioned, horses. These can have high costs because of illness, but also of vector control and surveillance activities that are required. West Nile virus is a disease that we can find in the United States, especially in places like Georgia. This is an arboviral fever disease, and the etiologic agent is a flavivirus. Mosquitoes carry the virus when they become infected after they feed on birds, and health effects vary from no symptoms to very severe symptoms. In the DeKalb County Board of Health, and they track viruses in mosquitoes to see if West Nile is circulating during our summers here. Emerging zoonotic diseases are diseases that were apparently new agents or by agents that have occurred in a place that they had not appeared before. Factors associated with emerging zoonoses are commonly ecological changes that result from agricultural practices, often associated with cultivating lands or with urbanization, changes in human population resulting in migration, and changes in human behavior where they're getting closer to animals where they weren't before. Two examples of emerging zoonoses include bovine spongiform encephalopathy, and this was the result of cattle processing, and they started using parts of the cattle that they weren't using previously, and it ended up resulting in a disease that humans were getting exposed to. Another example of an emerging zoonotic disease is hantavirus. In this case, hantaviruses were associated with climate change, rodent behavior, and humans near these rodents that caused the disease to spread in humans, originally in the Four Corners area of the United States. This is where New Mexico, Colorado, Arizona, and Utah all come together. Examples of bacterial zoonoses: E. coli 157H7 allowed mass food processing technology has allowed contamination of meat, caused a very severe outcome associated with one type of E. coli, and of course Cryptosporidium, which is a typically waterborne pathogen. Contaminated surface water and faulty water purification has resulted in this, but it's from cattle. Dengue fever, which worldwide is probably the most disseminated arbovirus, is caused by a flavivirus. When many of the strains are circulating, there can be high potential for dengue hemorrhagic fever, and death can be high in those cases, but occurs primarily in tropical, subtropical areas, including in South America, and the main transmission mosquito is an Aedes aegypti, very different from the mosquito that transmits malaria. In the United States, some cases of dengue have come. There's been very little circulation of dengue in the United States, but it has occurred along the border and in regions that have warm tropical temperatures. We saw Zika virus transmission occur in Miami, for example. It's very difficult to control mosquito-borne diseases. The main routes are to control the vector breeding habitat, like standing water. You can wear repellents and protective clothing, and of course use window screens, but if you work outside, that's not very effective. Some places will use chickens to monitor for diseases, but this is very limited in its approach.